Welcome to today's webinar. I'm really excited to have all of you here today for the second installation in our December webinar series. This one on Jewish identity, what employers need to know. We're the Brandeis Center, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. This webinar is part of our expanding work on preventing anti-Semitism in corporate America. We're very excited that our corporate work is part of this year's Shine a Light initiative, a campaign that brings together dozens of Jewish and non-Jewish organizations, companies, institutions, and individuals to call attention to and fight anti-Semitism in all the forms that American Jews face it today. We meet today on the Hanukkah holiday, a holiday that celebrates Jews' continuing peoplehood and self-determination at a time of oppression. And we meet at a time of increasing and widely misunderstood anti-Semitism in America. Understanding anti-Semitism, of course, means understanding Jewish identity. And we have three of the nation's leading authorities on understanding and explaining Jewish identity here with us today. First, we're very excited to have Oren Jacobson. Oren is a civic entrepreneur, thought leader, and policy advisor focused on helping communities and organizations build the strength and capacity necessary to improve people's lives. His civic advocacy spans local to international engagement. As the co-founder of Project Shema, he has advised major Jewish institutions and supported multinational corporations as a subject matter expert on anti-Semitism. He holds a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago, a master's degree in economics and policy analysis from DePaul University, and an MBA from Regis University. Our second panelist is Chen Mazzig. Chen is an award-winning Israeli author, a writer, and a speaker who has inspired thousands around the world with his story for over a decade. He was named one of the Allgemeiner's top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life in 2018 and 2021. He's been named among the top 50 online pro-Israel influencers and the top 50 LGBTQ plus influencers. In 2022, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis chose Chen to be its Portrait in Courage Award laureate. In 2019, he co-founded the Tel Aviv Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to using data-driven social media strategies to stand up for Jewish people and other minorities online. As the Institute's senior fellow, he has trained a dynamic roster of Jewish advocates in messaging and empowers a new generation of Jews to use publications, Twitter, Facebook, and other new media to advocate for tolerance and peace. Finally, Alyza Lewin. Alyza is our president and a co-founder and partner at Lewin & Lewin LLP. Her experience includes leading the litigation team that this year negotiated a successful resolution for Avi Zinger, the manufacturer and distributor of Ben & Jerry's ice cream in Israel, arguing Zhivatovsky versus Kerry, the Jerusalem passport case in the United States Supreme Court, and representing the Boehm family in their landmark lawsuit, which established that American victims of terror have the right to obtain damages in American courts from entities that knowingly provide material support for terror. She is a past president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and received the AAJLJ's Pursuit of Justice Award in January 2020. Just last month, she was named by Allgemeiner to their J100 as one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. She began her law career as a law clerk to Justice Menachem Elon, deputy president of the Israeli Supreme Court. She's a graduate of Princeton University and New York University School of Law. I'm proud and excited that we have all of you here with us today, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Oren to start us off.
Wonderful. Thanks for the invite, Arthur. And it's good to be with everybody. And Alyza, good to see you again. So my name is Oren, as Arthur said, and I want to talk a little bit about Jewish identity up front, but I want to start with a little bit of a personal story that will help sort of root how I ended up doing the work that I do. My grandfather is one of the few Jews from Poland to survive World War II. He came from a town called Lublin, Poland, which before the war had 40,000 people in it. Now, I live on the north side of Chicago, and there's a very famous building here called Wrigley Field where the Chicago Cubs play baseball. And some of you have probably been to that stadium. Others have been to a baseball stadium somewhere in America. And the rest of us have certainly been to some type of outdoor event, amphitheater, concert, literally surrounded by thousands of members of your community. The reason I mention Wrigley Field is because Wrigley Field can hold 40,000 people in it, which is the exact size of Lublin pre-World War II in terms of the Jewish population. My grandfather, as I mentioned, is from there. If you can imagine what it's like to be inside of a stadium like that with 40,000 people and the noise and the energy and the vibrancy of what it's like to be surrounded by your community, and then imagine what it would be like to be inside of that same stadium with fewer than 1,200 people, right? How quiet and lonely and empty and desolate that stadium would feel. My grandfather is one of fewer than 1,200 from his hometown to survive World War II. 97 out of every 100 Jews from Lublin, Poland were murdered by the Nazis. So the fact that I'm here with you today is literally a 3% proposition. And that's really guided my life in two directions. One has been to stand up for the Jewish people, and the second has been to stand up for all those who are attacked for the basic crime of being who they are in this country. And in doing that work in particular, working across lines of difference, one of the things that I've come to understand is how little I truly knew about the concerns and histories of other communities. And of course, how little people knew about my own history, my own story, the story of the Jewish people, and in particular, Jewish identity. And in talking about anti-Semitism, you actually have to start with the question of who are the Jewish people. In America in particular, most people misdefine or misunderstand Jews as a largely white or a white religious group, meaning we're essentially like evangelicals or Protestants or Catholics. We just pray differently and don't believe in Jesus as our Lord and Savior. Now, this is a problem on two levels. First, not all Jews are white presenting. In this country, roughly 15 to 20% of Jews would be identified as Jews of color. And if we went across the ocean to Israel, the majority of the Jewish people inside of the state of Israel would be identified by us as Jews of color. Now, it's really important to recognize that nobody in the Middle East, or I should say very few people in the Middle East, use American racial identity constructs. If you went up to a Jew in Israel and said you're white or brown or black, they'd look at you and say, what are you talking about? I'm an Israeli, I'm a Jew, I'm Ashkenazi, I'm Mizrahi, I'm Sephardi, which is to say that not all identity constructs fit into our Western frameworks. But the second problem with this is it actually narrowly misdefines or narrowly defines and completely misdefines who Jews are. Jews have identified as a people or a nation or an ethnic group with a shared culture, history, language, and yes, a shared religion for literally thousands of years longer than our understanding of modern organized religion. You see, Jewish identity doesn't fit neatly into American and Western identity constructs because Jewish identity predates American and Western identity constructs by literally thousands of years. So while most people think of Jews as a religious group, it's really critical to understand that Jews are a people. We are part of a people with a long connection. And most importantly, in helping you sort of think through the difference between a religious group and a people. If I were a Christian who said to you, I no longer believe in Christ as the Lord and Savior, and in fact, I am an atheist who does not believe in God, you wouldn't call me a Christian anymore. But if I am a Jewish person who is also an atheist, I am still a Jewish person and I'm still part of the Jewish people. And the reason why it's so important to start this conversation here, and I'll pass it back to you, Arthur, for the next panelist to jump in, is that most people, when they think of anti-Semitism, believe that anti-Semitism manifests as a form of religious bigotry, which is targeting Jews for how we pray, which means that you will likely miss anti-Semitism most of the times that it's present. Because in modern history, anti-Semitism has morphed over the centuries really to be more of a racialized bigotry. And to be clear, I'm not saying it's the same as racism. What I'm saying is that it's racialized. It has defined Jews and attacks Jews for who we are and what the anti-Semites accuse us of doing, not usually because of how we pray. And a really quick example before I pass it back, most of us are probably very familiar with the Tree of Life shooting. The massacre at a synagogue in Pittsburgh about 4 years ago on a Saturday morning on the Jewish Sabbath. The murderer at the Tree of Life synagogue didn't enter the synagogue that day because he was upset about the Torah portion that was being read from the bima, or the pulpit, that day. He chose that synagogue because he blamed Jews for the browning of America, for undermining the white race in America. And so the synagogue in this case was nothing more than a physical container to find Jewish people. And that is part of the reason why it's so critical to understand who and what Jews are, and not to think about us through the traditional lens of America's America and the Western world's racial framework, because of our identity and really anti-Semitism don't fit neatly into that construct. So Jews identify as a people with a shared religion, though our commitment to or practice of that religion has no bearing on whether or not we are part of the Jewish people, and it has no bearing, I should add, on whether or not the anti-Semites in this world choose to attack us. No anti-Semite goes up to Chen and says, "Hey, Chen, when was the last time you went to synagogue?" And if his answer is 2 weeks, they attack him. And if his answer is 2 years, they don't. That's not how this works. Chen is a Jew. And regardless of whether or not Chen prays regularly or doesn't believe in God, Chen will be attacked for being a Jew. And that's why it's so critical to start the conversation about anti-Semitism with a conversation that we're having today on Jewish identity.
Thanks, Oren. That was wonderful and really illuminating, I think. And your last reference takes us directly to our next speaker. So, Chen, perhaps you could take it away and tell us a little bit about your work.
Of course, thank you so much. And it's what Oren says is such a, it's so profound, and it's so important that we are starting the conversation. So just very grateful that we have leaders like Oren in our community that are able to speak so eloquently about this issue, because as Oren said, it's Jews are not, we're not a religion. We are not just a religion, rather, that we are an ethnic group, and we started from Israel. That's where I grew up, in Israel. My family came to Israel in the early 50s from Iraq and from Tunisia, from North Africa. They were Mizrahi Jews. They are Mizrahi Jews. Some people use Sephardi as it's more comfortable, as it's more. Some Sephardi Jews would prefer to be identified as Sephardi because of their religious practices, the way that they practice their Jewish faith. But Mizrahi really encapsulate for me and for many others the fact that we are from the East. Mizrahi means East. And my family were forced out of their land in Iraq and Tunisia, and they were part of almost 1 million people that were forced out from, were ethnically cleansed from those countries, from this 30 Muslim countries in the Middle East and North Africa, even before the creation of Israel, the recreation of a Jewish state in this land, to 1972. And they were never recognized as refugees by the world or got any serious attention. And I think it took me so much time. As Oren mentioned, over 50% of Israeli Jews are just from the Middle East and North Africa. And it took me so much time to really understand what a Jew of color, what a person of color means. And because it's not something we use in Israel. Actually, my first book that just came out last month, it's called The Wrong Kind of Jew and Mizrahi Manifesto. I wrote it in English, and many people asked me, well, why aren't you writing it in Hebrew? And I said, we really don't have the language in Hebrew to, even the term person of color is not something that can be translated neatly into Hebrew, because it's not, when you have a country that the majority of it is by this definition are person of color, it's very difficult to discuss it. And I think that also because Jews have been the people that had the longest diaspora of any people, one of the longest diasporas of any people, and we have returned to our homeland, it's hard for people to recognize that Jewish people are not part of the dominated homogeneous country, in the West, that is. And the same way that I think Jewish people in Europe have been oppressed as a minority, we have been oppressed as a minority, but in a different way, of course. But we also suffered from the Holocaust. My grandparents from Tunisia had to work in forced labor camp, and my grandparents from Iraq faced the Farhud, 2 days of violent attacks against the Jews of Iraq. but all of it is really is the experience that I had that I didn't think I needed to share until I moved to America. I lived in Seattle for a few years. I thought that people would appreciate a Mizrahi gay Jew that is while I'm not visiting the synagogue as often as I wish I could, and I until recently I wasn't really keeping kosher. I'm still a Jewish person, and being Jewish is probably the first thing that people will tell you if you ask who I am. They will answer that I'm Jewish, because this is such a big part of my identity, and it doesn't matter how I practice my Jewish religion. Think that in a sense that our Jewish practices is a way to just manifest our identity. And if you speak to Native American, specifically Native American Jews, they will tell you that there's so many similarities between the practices of the Jewish faith, like how we wave four different species of plants to 6 directions of the wind. That's an indigenous people's practice. Or if you're asking about inviting spirits into their homes, every Friday Jews invite spirits into our homes. We call them the angels of peace. We invite them to sit with us and bless us. That's a very indigenous practice. And you are indigenous as long as you maintain the relationship to the land. I know that it's very hard for Western non-Jews to see Jews as indigenous people, but we are, beside the conversation that we'll get to in a second about race or where we fit into the racial hierarchy, we are indigenous people because we maintain this connection to our land. We pray towards Jerusalem. We orient ourselves towards Jerusalem. When we speak about Jerusalem, it's not just and I think our identity has been diluted so much that a lot of Jews have believed that as well, that we're just a religion, and we're not just a religion. The religion is just a manifestation of our Jewish identity and our heritage and our connection and our culture and our history to the land of Israel. That's where we started. That's where we are today facing. That's where we're hoping to go back to, even if we live in the diaspora. And again, it goes back to the fact that we had such a long diaspora. We weren't able to go back to our land and rebuild our homeland, but now we can. And when we're talking about racial structure in America, as I said, when I got to Seattle, I really did not fully understand why people were not seeing me as someone that does, or it is a progressive movement, which I feel like I'm part of, because I do support LGBTQ rights. I support women's rights. I'm anti-racist activist. I believe that Israel is a manifestation of all of it. As a minority, as a son of refugees that did not have anywhere else to go, that America did not open the gates to those million Jewish refugees, those Jews of color that have been forced out from Arab countries. But I think that the reason that I was not perceived as worthy of having a seat at the table was because I was Jewish and Israeli. People were often challenging me and saying, well, you're a queer person that is from Israel, so tell us where you stand on Israel, which is ridiculous. What would they say to an Iranian person? Where do you stand on Iranian queer person that goes to speak in America? Would he be challenged about this? Not to compare the horrific human rights violation of civilians in Iran to the challenges that we're facing in Israel. And there are challenges. I'll be the first one to tell you that I'm extremely not happy about the government that was just announced in Israel. But with not being happy about it, I know it's a democracy, and I know that it will change, and I know that many Israelis are not happy with that as well. And we had a left-wing government just a few months ago. So that's the natures of democracy. But no one, going back to this point, that no one would be challenged based on their national origin, specifically if it's connected to their ethnicity, the same way that I'm challenged constantly for being an Israeli. So it's connecting to my queer identity. It also connects to my where do I fit into this racial structure. So we can realize that, yes, there are Black Jews that have different experience when they are a minority in Western countries. We can realize that there are Jews of color that have different experiences in those countries. But we can also realize, and I think it's very important that we say that Jews do not enjoy white privilege, and the idea that Jews are white in and of itself is ridiculous. When Jews are being, we're living in Christian countries. I don't think there's a problem with having a Christian country, just like there's a Jewish country, but it is a Jewish country, and we are reminded of it just now with Christmas, or every Sunday we are reminded that we live in Christian country, and that's all right. I don't think there's a problem with having Christian country or 57 Muslim countries or one Jewish country, but we need to recognize that as long as you are a minority, you don't benefit from, or at least you don't benefit to the full extent of this privilege. And to say that Jews can. I heard that statement being said from someone recently about how Jewish women can, and I'm quoting this person saying Jewish women can just get a creatine treatment and nose job and change their last name, and then they pass into whiteness. But why does Jews feel the need that they need to do that? Why do they need to alter who they are, change themselves, change their appearance to be accepted? If they were accepted, if they were benefiting to the full extent of white privilege, they wouldn't feel like they have to hide it, right? So as long as they feel like they have to do it, as long as Jews think twice about wearing a kippah, yes, I understand that you can take the kippah off, but taking kippah off means that you're not practicing your identity, or you're altering who you are. So that is in and of itself is a reminder for us that we are a marginalized minority. We're not benefiting from white privilege, even if we have a wider skin color. But I think that the reason that we are not seen as so, and specifically for me as a Mizrahi gay Jew, that I see that in the West I'm not being accepted fully by the progressive movement, I think it's because they cannot recognize the fact that we in the Middle East, Jewish people were oppressed as a group because we were Jews by other people of color that were part of this Arab empire, and that's so long and so a nuanced conversation to have. But there is an imperial, the Arab world that we see in it today in the Middle East is part of the imperial approach of or aspiration of the Islamic world, and Jews in the Middle East, just like Copts or Maronite Christians or Armenians, Kurds, have been an oppressed minority. And just like the Armenians, we were able to reclaim our indigenous homeland and revive our language. And instead of that being celebrated by the West just can't see us thriving as something to be celebrated because of this connection of, they need to support the underdog, I think. And I think that the Jews, our old story is about survival and thriving. We're celebrating Hanukkah, which is just about that, how we overcome those hardships. And it's hard for people, I think specifically people of privilege, to look at this survival and people thriving and say, okay, we can understand that they're surviving and thriving, but they can also face challenges in their lives. People want things very easy, and our story is not easy. And I don't think that because people want it to be easy, we have to to reduce ourselves or to change ourselves. We're just not basic, and that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Chen. There was a lot to unpack there. Really appreciate it. And finally, we'll turn to Alyza for the last presentation. As she starts, I'll encourage all of you in the audience to put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll have a long time to deepen this discussion with all the panelists after we hear from Alyza.
I'm on mute. There we go. Yes. Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Oren, and thank you, Chen. It's a pleasure to be here. And since Oren and Chen started with a little bit about their background and their identity, I'll start there too. Oren, we may be distant family. My father was born in Poland. He was born in Lodz, and he had to flee as a very small child with his parents. My great-grandfather was actually not only the chief rabbi in a city in the south of Poland called Rzeszów or Rasha. He was the Rasha Rav, but he was also an elected member of the Polish Sejm. So he was a politician representing the Agudath Israel in the Polish parliament. And he was killed during the war. My father fled. My grandparents were the first to obtain what is known as the Sugihara visas. That was the Japanese consul in Lithuania who provided the visas that permitted Jews to flee. My grandmother was the one who was actually instrumental in opening up that path, and they received the first of those Sugihara transit visas and were able to reached the United States, but my father only knew one of his grandparents because all three perished in the Holocaust together with most of the family. That's on my father's side. On my mother's side, my maternal grandmother was actually born in the old city of Jerusalem when it was under Ottoman rule. And her family goes back and went back 7 generations in Israel to the early 1800s. I had family that came and lived there because, as you were hearing from Chen, that's what they viewed was their home as Jews. So I really have felt that in me. When Oren talks about what motivates the work that he does, in me, I feel are kind of my personal history are the 2 probably most defining moments in recent Jewish history. meet in my own personal history, the combination of the Holocaust and the horrors of the Holocaust and the rebirth of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. So that's my identity. I think what both Chen and Oren have said is really important, right? The crux of our whole discussion today about Jewish identity is to understand that Jews are more than just a group defined by their religion and their religious practice. They are also a people, and they are a people defined by their history, by their heritage, by their culture. And that history, that ancestry, that ethnicity is completely and totally rooted in the land of Israel. It is not possible to separate Jewish ancestry and ethnicity from the land of Israel. And you have Jews who define their Jewish identity differently. It's true, right? Not all Jews observe Shabbat, right? But we recognize that if you're going to discriminate against an individual based on their religious practice, that's unlawful discrimination. By the same token, what we have to realize today is that if there's a Jew who defines their Jewish identity as celebrating this Jewish ancestral ethnic heritage that's connected to the land of Israel, if they view that as an integral part of what it means to them to be a Jew, then discriminating against them or targeting them on that basis is also discriminatory and unlawful. So what we see today, which is particularly troubling, is not only this targeting of Jews on the basis of their Jewish identity and their sense of Jewish peoplehood, but we actually see now today a determined effort to deny this idea of Jewish peoplehood, deny this part of Jewish identity, and to actually erase any recognition of our Jewish history, right? This is more than just Holocaust denial, right, which people have become accustomed to, people who suggest that the Holocaust didn't happen or they distort the Holocaust. We now actually have people who are denying the Jewish history and Jewish connection to the land of Israel. So, for example, when Bill Clinton wrote about the Camp David negotiations, he wrote about how surprised he was at how Yasser Arafat actually suggested that there never was a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, right? This is now not just Yasser Arafat who's saying that. You have at the UN where they will only refer to the Temple Mount using the Arabic name, promoting this idea that there never was Jewish history there, right? This is an attempt to deny also the history of beyond Israel, just the history of Jews in terms of our history of the kind of the roller coaster ride that Jews always have of oppression and persecution that comes after a flourishing, right? So Chen was talking about the expulsion of Jews from Arab lands. There had been a period of time where Jews flourished in Arab lands before they were all kicked out of those Arab lands. Spain, Jews flourished in Spain before they were expelled from Spain, right? Even in terms of the Holocaust, Jews were flourishing in Germany and in Austria before the Holocaust. There's this insistence that it's impossible today, if you see Jews, they can't be the targets of anti-Semitism. They can't be the targets of discrimination. Why? Because that history is somehow erased. That history is denied. And I see we put in the chat box, there's now a term for that. Ben Freeman had an article where he coined the term erasive anti-Semitism, and we can share his article as well as the Reut group did a more lengthy piece on it. This is a form of anti-Semitism that actually seeks to erase and deny Jewish identity and Jewish history. And what happens, right, is when you have, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that are designed to try and educate and sensitize communities, whether it's in a company or at a university, or these DEI programs are designed to try and raise sensitivity to bias and harassment and discrimination based on identity. And these groups, these programs will often ignore Jewish identity, right? They don't talk about Jews as an ethno-religion. They don't discuss the history that Jews have had with anti-Semitism. They don't recognize that anti-Semitism is society's oldest hatred. They not only ignore that, but oftentimes what's worse is that the only way these programs sometimes discuss or incorporate Jews is by talking about Jews in a way that just adopts the old anti-Semitic stereotypes, right? They will describe Jews as powerful and controlling and privileged and sinister, right? If you think about it today, we have rhetoric on both the right and the left extremes that are beginning to sound very similar, because what they all seem to be saying is that Jews have this extraordinary power they're able to control, and they use that power and control to harm our society today in some ways, right? And whether that's coming from white supremacists on the right, whether you hear it in the words of Kanye West, right, who suggests that all of his misfortune is because of the Jews, or whether you hear it coming from the left, suggesting that all Jews are white oppressors, colonialists, and that any Jew who believes that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, that person may be very critical of the policies of the current government of Israel, but if they believe, because they take pride in their Jewish ancestry and heritage, that Jews have a right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland, if that's part of their Jewish identity, then they are shunned. They are viewed as pariahs. And in today's society, where we believe, right, that each individual should be given the courtesy and the respect to define their own identity for themselves, and that each identity has the right to also define what oppression or discrimination of that identity looks like and feels like, to deny that courtesy only to Jews is discriminatory. So to try and wrap up, why are we talking about this today, right? Why is this even important to employers when we talk about Jewish identity and what you need to know about Jewish identity in the workplace? For employers, they need to understand the full depth, the full breadth, the full richness of Jewish identity, because they need to understand that in order to make sure that they are protecting their Jewish employees from the possible creation of a hostile environment in that workplace, they need to realize that Jews need more than just religious accommodations, right? Jews need to be protected on the basis of our identity as the Jewish people, protected on the basis of our expression of our pride in our shared ancestral and ethnic heritage. And if employers don't understand or don't recognize that part of Jewish identity, then they risk missing and not seeing the hostile environment that could be taking place and existing in their workplace.
Great. Thanks, Alyza. And thanks to all of you. I'll remind everyone again to put your questions for our panelists in the Q&A box. But maybe I'll start and take the moderator's privilege with this one. And Oren, I've heard you talk in the past about how anti-Semitism relates to other types of bigotry, and particularly maybe leading in with some of those conspiracy theories that Alyza was just talking about, those anti-Semitic false conspiracy theories. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, so let me say a few things about this, because I think one of the questions that people get to when they're thinking about the Jewish community, anti-Semitism, and DEI is often a little bit of uncertainty about how this all fits into broader DEI work, in large part because so much of our DEI work in America is understandably and necessarily rooted in the equity, right? In sort of transforming systems and structures to enable those who have been at the margins and often either communities have been disinvested in or intentionally, targeted to sort of have access to things that have been denied. And so when you think about the Jewish community as a community of privilege in the way that the story is told in the American context, it doesn't quite make sense. And so I just want to name in particular here that our concerns are typically around the idea of inclusion and belonging. That's not to say that there aren't Jews who suffer inequity in this society, especially Jews who may not look exactly like I do in this society, meaning a white presenting, able-bodied man. But in the context of inclusion and belonging, and really in the context of broader DEI work, right? The purpose of DEI work in the corporate perspective is to make sure that each employee feels heard, seen, cared for. And that is part of, I think, an intentional strategy, yes, to respond to the outside world and to build a healthy, thriving culture that people want to be a part of, that they're connected to. And that obviously impacts a corporation's bottom line when you have less retention and a happier workforce. And yet, when we exclude the Jewish community and anti-Semitism education from the tapestry of DEI work, we end up excluding, and to use the word that's been offered so far, erasing the Jewish community's concerns, trauma, history, and that goes to undermine the psychological safety of Jewish employees in our spaces. And I think that's really important to recognize, especially when you think about the corporate world, where hopefully none of us fear for our physical safety, but not all of us feel psychologically welcome, included, and safe in these spaces. And that's part of the reason why we're having this conversation. I want to speak, though, more directly to your exact question, which is around how anti-Semitism works within the context of these conspiracy theories, because it's really important to recognize that anti-Semitism, while it's a problem that most directly impacts Jews, it is a problem that will hurt everybody in this society. And I want to be very clear how and why. Anti-Semitism is fundamentally built on a series of conspiracy theories, and let's use a different word for conspiracy theories, which are lies. Anti-Semitism is built on a series of stories that are lies, that are made up, which blame Jews for various traits and problems of society. Whether it's a war or an economic hardship or even COVID, the Jews have been blamed for it. And the problem is, whenever you allow lies to go mainstream in a society, it undermines shared fact and shared truth. And there is no way to maintain a democratic society without shared fact and shared truth. And without a democratic society, there is no way to maintain civil rights and protections for minority groups, unless, of course, you have a benevolent king or queen. But the history of humankind is not littered with benevolence in terms of dictators and authoritarians. So you need democracy to protect civil rights. You need civil rights to protect minority groups. And because anti-Semitism is built on lies that undermine shared truth, it makes it really difficult to maintain a democratic society when anti-Semitism is mainstreamed in the society, which inherently means that all marginalized communities suffer when anti-Semitism is spreading throughout your society. And it's important to note that anti-Semitism is part of the modern fuel of white supremacist movements in America. We all remember the Buffalo shooting that happened recently that targeted a group of Black grocery shoppers. If you read the manifesto of that shooter, yes, of course, it was an anti-Black racist shooting. But inside of that manifesto were deep, long anti-Semitic screeds blaming the Jews, in which he said the Jews have it coming and we'll deal with them. We'll deal with them soon. And so even if you think about the statement, Jews will not replace us, which became really famous because of Charlottesville, or the Great Replacement theory, which has become famous in some conspiracy settings, especially on the right of America today. The story is this: if you're a white supremacist, you inherently think Black and brown people are inferior. Well, then how do you explain how Black and brown people have gotten status in our society? Or how do you explain a Black man in the White House? The white supremacist doesn't think a Black or brown person is capable as an inferior race of achieving that status on their own. So they blame the Jews, that the Jews are conducting this conspiracy to uplift Black and brown, take this white nation away from its rightful inhabitants. And I say this to say, if you are someone who is deeply committed to challenging white supremacy and is thinking about the ways in which that form of hate impacts in particular Black and Brown, but also Muslim and LGBTQ and women and non-binary folks in this country, etc. You can't ignore anti-Semitism and expect to address that issue, because at the root of modern white supremacist movements is the belief that the Jew is ultimately responsible for the ways in which the society is changing.
I just wanted to add one thing to, and I thought that was excellent, Oren. One piece going back to when you were talking about DEI programs and focusing on belonging and inclusion. And I think it's important to also recognize that sometimes what happens, and this is unfortunate, is that when Jewish employees or try to address the issue of anti-Semitism and they try and raise it, when that anti-Semitism that they've experienced is denied, right? When the people who are listening say that can't possibly be anti-Semitism, right? There's this denial of its existence. Then what happens is they then twist the individual's attempt to try and share their lived experience into a hostile statement, because somehow what happens is the mere fact that the Jewish individual is trying to describe their lived experience is somehow viewed as an offense to others, because it's trying to either center the conversation on Jews, remove the focus from other communities or groups where people feel it's needed, and especially if the feeling is that the Jew is essentially crying wolf, right? They're talking about something that doesn't exist, then they certainly have no right to be bringing it up. And so it is the need for the DEI programs to both include the understanding of Jewish identity and include it so that when, if it's not already there to begin with, when Jews try to add it and try to address it, they don't then become targeted because they did that, right?
That's a great example of something that an employer, in fact, all of us shouldn't do, is talk over Jews about what anti-Semitism is or deny the lived experiences that they're having. What are some big things that employers should or can do to recognize and protect people of Jewish identity in their workplaces?
I'll let Chen or Oren take that first.
And go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think, first of all, just like any other form of bigotry that other communities facing, when it's when you see bigotry, you call it out, don't let it slide. And when you see when you hear anti-Semitic statements, just have a conversation about that. When people say something about Jews, we say something about that and we open it up. Same thing when Israel comes up, when everyone can criticize any country around the world. No one is saying that criticism of Israel is not okay, but when this criticism sounds to you, and it sure does sound to a lot of people as anti-Semitism, maybe find resources to realize if it is or isn't anti-Semitism. The IRA definition of anti-Semitism is a helpful tool to find that out, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. But I really think that it's important to have the conversation and not let those things slide. And you mentioned, Arthur, that we need to let Jews define what anti-Semitism is, and not use minority within this community and to elevate them, like it's been done to several other minority communities. We're seeing it being done to the Black community when fringe voices from within this community are being elevated, or from my community, for the gay community, we often see people like I remember Dolce & Gabbana, the two fashion designers that while they are both gay men, we're talking about how gay men should not be allowed to be married, advocating against the best interests of their community. The same way when a Jewish person is saying that anti-Semitism isn't a problem, or that anti-Israel sentiment are not a problem, and that are not anti-Semitism, think twice about it and look into resources and while I'm not saying don't silence anyone, let people say what they want to say, but also it's important to recognize when a minority from within a minority community doesn't advocate for the best interests of this community, or that they don't represent the widespread ideas within this community. Majority of American Jews are Zionists. Half of the world Jewish population lives in Israel and are, by the fact that they have Israeli nationality, are Zionists. So to say that anti-Zionism is not, is a legitimate view within the Jewish community, it's absolutely not a legitimate view. It's a view that exists, and it's okay to have it, but it's also important to recognize it as a fringe and underrepresented opinion that advocates against the best interests of the entire Jewish community.
Yeah, I got two really quick points to build on that. One is, whenever somebody says to me, how should I be an ally to Jews? My answer is almost always, how do you want me to be an ally to you? Generally speaking, those two things are the same. Obviously, Jewish identity and anti-Semitism may not be as clearly understood for somebody as maybe being part of the LGBTQ plus community might be just more inherent right away. Although, again, I think we're all learning more and more each day about the way different communities are being discriminated against and the history of that discrimination. But, do for us what you would ask us to do for you is a pretty simple rule here. And the second thing is, if you do have employee resource groups, it's really important not just to enable or allow a Jewish employee resource group within the parameters in terms of what your requirements are to set up those employee resource groups, but to ensure that those ERGs are set up for Jews as a people and an ethnic or demographic group, and not exclusively as a religious community. And I say that because if you, I don't want to use the word force, but if you force a Jewish ERG to be part of, or to simply be identified as a religious group, you're going to mislabel Jewish identity, literally erase the way that many Jews around the world identify. And most importantly, for my concerns, you're going to push forward the inaccurate perception of Jewish identity and make it harder for people who are not Jewish to spot anti-Semitism when it's present. And that's why the identity question is actually so critical, because most of us are looking for something about the way that we pray to find the anti-Semitism, but the anti-Semitism almost never shows up about the way that we pray. And so it's really critical, if you do ERGs, that you allow a Jewish ERG, and that Jewish ERG be defined as a cultural or ethnic or demographic group. And then within the ERG itself, it's really important for the Jewish leaders of that ERG to create a space that is fully inclusive of all Jews, regardless of how they identify on a personal level.
That was great. And the next time somebody asks me to explain anti-discrimination work while I'm standing on one leg, I'll borrow part of that answer, Oren. I'm going to slightly paraphrase a question that we got in the Q&A, which is, Oren, you've talked some about peoplehood and about our ancestry, our traditions. Somebody asks in the Q&A, essentially, are the obligations to understand Jewish peoplehood and that aspect of Jewish identity, are they any different for someone who's decided to convert to Judaism or is in the process of converting?
I don't know if you're muted. I will say, if the person is converting, if they're, first of all, it does not matter, honestly, if the person, if the discrimination is based on the person's actual or perceived Jewish identity, then that's sufficient. I also would say that just as being part of the Jewish people, there's the understanding that when you convert, you become part of the Jewish people. There's the tradition that even says that all the souls of all the Jewish people were present at Mount Sinai when the 10 commandments were given. So if you've converted to Judaism or in the process of converting to Judaism, you are part of the Jewish people. And this whole discussion that we're having would apply also to converts to Judaism as well.
Can I take it a step further? Not only converts to Judaism, also partners of Jewish people that are not Jewish and suffer from discrimination because of that affiliation. My partner is not Jewish, and he often hears anti-Semitic comments. And while it's not while it's not his identity, he is related to a Jewish person. He has a home with a Jewish person, and our kids are going to be raised Jewish as well. So I mean, and we do celebrate, we celebrate the holidays, and he had to go through a long process at his work to let them understand that on Fridays he need to be at home early in the evening because we have Kiddush, and that's a very important tradition for us. So not only converts, but also people that are related, children of Jewish parents, Jewish parents of Jewish children, and Jewish spouses.
Yeah, to add a little like texture to this, right? So one, the religious aspects of Judaism, we don't evangelize, we don't recruit, right? So like if someone chooses to convert, it's a tough process, it's a long process, and there's a lot of studying that's involved. And one of the things that you learn about when you dig into to who we are, which is why I think, Chen made the point so clearly, you really can't extract that physical geography from Jewish identity. And it's really important to recognize that the word Israel, or the idea of Israel, is derives from a person in the Torah, right? A man who ends up having his name changed to Israel. And then his descendants become the 12 tribes of Israel, literally his 12 children, the 12 tribes that descend from this man known as Israel in this territory. And so there's no way to go through a conversion process and learn Jewish history and study the Torah and not have it fully and firmly rooted in this connection to that land. Even the word Jew or Jewish, right, derives from a Hebrew word Yehudi, which goes back to this English translation of from Judea, which again is part of this broader geography that has been central to so much of the world's fighting for so long. But all those things are part of the process. Someone who is converting to Judaism learns and understands. And so it's almost impossible to disconnect any of that stuff, because if you're accepting and embracing that culture and tradition, you're leaning in to that entire story.
There's a saying, taking us away from that topic for a moment, there's a saying that anti-Semites punch down while they're pretending to punch up. And I was thinking about it while some of you were talking about racial structure and perceptions of privilege or equity. But can you explain that maybe to our audience and how it fits into what needs to be done to properly place Jews in DEI programming? Oren, I think you're muted.
Go ahead, Oren.
I'm asking the punch up, punch down dynamic.
Yes, go ahead, talk about that. I've heard you. And
yeah, so let's go back to this white supremacist story I said about Jews will not replace us as an example, right? The story is that somehow this group that is both less than and not actually white is also at the same time powerful enough to coordinate a nationwide and global conspiracy to rob the white race of this country. So at the same time, you have this group saying we're not white and we're less than, but we have these special powers. And so you have this like punch up, punch down dynamic. But in the context of DEI work, because so many Jews in America are white presenting or understood as white and therefore privileged and sort of at the top of the racial power structure, it's understandable why people would exclude us without having any ill intent from the conversation. And so you have this dynamic of both being punched up and being punched down by different people in different groups. And I think that's sort of the question that you were getting to, but anyone should jump in here.
Yeah, I think the punch up, punch down dynamic is also interesting because it has made it more challenging sometimes on social media for the algorithms to pick it up. I remember hearing that Facebook had this initially because they were so used to looking for the comments that would denigrate a group, that would suggest they're less than. And so much of the anti-Semitic rhetoric was punching up, was suggesting that the Jews are powerful, they're controlling. And so they had to rearrange the algorithms to actually be able to capture some of the, anti-Semitic rhetoric that was taking place online.
And that takes us back some to the conspiracy theories that you've all talked about and that Ambassador Lipstadt said last Friday are the central thing people need to understand about anti-Semitism, the threat messaging that those pose that can appear to somebody who doesn't understand what's happening to almost be flattery, except that it's power being used for a very sinister, very coordinated kind of way, and ones that we hear, as Alyza said earlier, from all sectors of American society. We've talked about the corporate workplace a lot today, and just to make sure we're being, very clear and very fair, is this something that we only see in corporate settings, or is it something that we also see on sports teams, on campuses, in choirs, all different types of social organizations?
I think the unfortunate thing is, Arthur, you and I know we work a lot with students on campus. We definitely see this on campuses. We see this with the organizations on campus that are supposed to be dedicated, like the DEI programs, they are to addressing the bias and discrimination, and they are frequently missing it. They're just not seeing it because they don't understand this whole notion of Jewish identity. And then it festers, and the students are really feeling marginalized and shunned. They're feeling pushed out of communities, activities, programs on issues that they care deeply about, right? We've had students who want to be involved in sexual assault survivor groups that have been pushed out when they express support for the idea that the Jews are an ethnic group that comes from Israel, right? We have seen students who have been pushed out of their positions in student government because they're Zionists. We've seen students, we've seen clubs on campuses where students have had to create LGBT Jew groups because they have not felt comfortable in the LGBTQ groups. So this is definitely not limited to the workplace, unfortunately. I don't know, Chen could probably talk about students that he's worked with and what he's seen as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we also worked on, you worked on cases that were relating to students that I worked with, or students that shared some of my content on social media and were attacked for it. Content that was just purely talking about facts and where Jews have originated from. Or, when I come to speak on college campuses, I think one of the worst situations happened in 2016 at University College London, where 300 students came to shut me down. They didn't want me to speak. And my talk is only about peace, coexistence, national rights for both Israelis and Palestinians, and how we should live together, and my LGBTQ identity, and my family's story. And all of this was, it's constantly an issue of controversy on college campuses, on social media. And it is truly everywhere. We speak about your, seeing, when you see something at work, that it's not just at work, it's happening elsewhere as well. And that's why we need to be so vigilant, and we need to speak up about it. And I think it's even more dangerous and more urgent because how this specific form of bigotry is being perceived. I think I mentioned to you that my partner had went to a diversity inclusion D&I training, and the person that was doing the training said that unlike Muslims, LGBTQ, people of color, etc., the only group that doesn't really experience bigotry is the Jewish community, because anti-Semitism isn't a violent form, which we all know is not true. But the fact that this is being taught as part of D&I training tells us a lot about how dangerous and urgent the situation is.
I just want to, Arthur, before we close, say that I really do think, and even listening to what Chen is saying now, just how significant it is that we've held this program during the holiday of Hanukkah. Because Hanukkah, one of the things that it really does symbolize is the strength of the Jewish people to push back against those who sought to pressure the Jews to shed their Jewish identity, right? We even think about the dreidel, the little spinning top, right? The tradition or the legend is that was developed because when Jews were forbidden to study the Torah, to study their heritage, the Bible, and so what they did is to hide the fact, right? If the Greeks came by and saw that they were studying, they quickly put away the books, took away the dreidels, and They were just playing games. We shouldn't have to hide our Jewish identity. We shouldn't have to apologize for our Jewish identity. And I know I saw in some of the comments, people who said, yes, in the AEFI group, students are feeling this, employees are feeling this, folks who just want to be involved in women's rights issues, LGBT issues, climate change issues, just the general public, they're even starting to feel it. And we need to be like the Jews of old, the Jews of the time of Hanukkah and the Maccabees. We need to fight back and take pride in our Jewish identity and realize that, with the Brandeis Center, with help of organizations like Chen and Project Shema and the Brandeis Center and others, we can fight back, we can succeed, and we should be able to continue to celebrate and take pride in our Jewish ethnic and ancestral heritage, our religious practice, all of it fully for a long time to come.
That's right. And we've got comments in the Q&A from someone who's said she works at a place that doesn't understand Jewish identity properly. And for those of you who've had that experience, who are working with your employer or your university or any other type of organization to help them better include Jews, better include anti-discrimination against Jews, better include anti-Semitic discrimination in their DEI programming and in their anti-discrimination work. Our contact information is in the chat. Project Shema's contact information is in the chat. Feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to help. With that, I want to thank Chen, Alyza, and Oren. Thank everyone for being here, for the questions, and thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Thank everyone for joining us, particularly during the holidays. For all of those of you celebrating this month, happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.